Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. You can see that there are some tips about how to ask questions or leave comments, do other things using Zoom. This is new for all of us, so don't be concerned if you commit a faux pas. I've committed several already, so don't worry about it. In order for me to hear you, you will need to unmute yourself. And in the meantime, you are able to ask questions or raise your hand, and we'll sort of figure this out as we go. I guess I would say that I'm really thrilled that so many people enjoyed the movie and found the movie interesting and to be a good recommendation. It's something that I first saw when I was an undergraduate, and I actually saw it in a journalism class, and it stuck with me ever since because that was a number of years ago. And I think it's a wonderful document of American culture in the late 1950s, and I think it's surprising that it is still relevant in as many ways as it is. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the film they want to start us off with?
Bro, you got a question. Somebody's got a mic. That's what I'll do.
Yes.
So who has a question?
How was this film received when it first opened?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. It was well received, but it didn't sort of set the world on fire. I think a lot of critics and industry people sort of saw it as alarmist. I think they were also a little bit wary of Schulberg's and Kazan's take on anything that could seem remotely political after On the Waterfront from 3 years earlier. I also think that it's really interesting how kind of anti-populist and anti-television it is, and those sentiments wouldn't have been as pervasive as maybe they are today in some circles. I also think that television and its impact on the political process was still really in its infancy. So it might not, that criticism in particular might not have had the purchase that it does with us today. There had been the Checkers speech, which is referenced in the film.
Right.
There had been Eisenhower's television ads, which were actually a source of, I guess, research and or inspiration for the film. But compared to the sort of decades of the impact of television on the political process that we all have, it wouldn't have had nearly the traction. Is there another question or a comment? Emmeline.
Oh, I pushed a button. I didn't mean to
Well, that's okay.
ask a question. But I mean, overall, I really, I was amazed by how the film related to our society today. And I guess if I had a question, it would be, did everybody else have the same gut response to that? Comparing, the political situation in the film to what we're experiencing today.
Well, and it's a really, and I mean, I would love to hear what other people think, but I didn't mean to put the pressure on you, Emmeline. I just saw your box pop up, but I promise not to just randomly make people ask questions in the future. But if I'll speak to your point before other people want to chime in, if they do, which is that, like I said earlier, I first came across this film when I was in college, and I think we would all agree that while populism has always been a current in our political system, political culture, certainly over the last 4, 6, however many years, it's really gained increased prominence and traction. And so one of the things I like about the film so much is that even movies from that era that are the issue of which is still relevant today. I'll give an example like Rebel Without a Cause or Blackboard Jungle, 2 movies I really, really like that are about, in essence, juvenile delinquency and its causes and problems, which is still an issue today. Even though the issue is still current, the movies don't seem current. But this is a movie where I think the issue is current, but the actual content of the movie itself also seems as relevant, not just the problem it's discussing. And I think that's one of the great things about it. Bonnie?
What?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Someone just posted a comment. When people saw the film, they didn't know Andy Griffith as we do, and that's absolutely true. And I have to say that when I saw this, I still remember I saw this film, as I said, in a class that was about journalism, and our professor, who, how do I say
On the
that?
desk.
Our professor was not the most lighthearted gentleman, although he was a very smart gentleman. I would encourage people, by the way, that if you're not actively talking, to mute. In the bottom
Wrap
left,
it in one piece.
in the bottom left, turn the microphone red. There you go. Anyway, he asked us for our comments immediately after the film, and my comment was, boy, that Matlock sure can act, because that's what I knew Andy Griffith from. And so the comment that people would have gone to this and it wouldn't have seemed as much of a revelation to them, because Andy Griffith was, even though he was known for sort of more comedic roles, he'd definitely done some drama work. It wouldn't have been as shocking a performance as I think it is for many of us who know him from his 2 main TV shows. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah, we have another question here about the depiction of women in the film. And the female protagonist, played by Patricia Neal, is a very interesting character. And I think it's kind of a kind of split that we tend to see in a lot of Hollywood movies, not necessarily just from that era, where you kind of have women fall into 2 camps. There's either Marcia was the Patricia Neal character. You either have the sort of, quote unquote, uptight, intelligent, intellectual, assertive, ambitious, accomplished woman. And then you have sort of the kind of good time gals, right? And that they're not meant to be taken in any way sort of seriously. They're just kind of there to kind of be women for the men. And we see that in the Lee Remick character, and we see it in some of the other even more minor female roles. The thing I find interesting that kind of complicates that split a bit are all the cutaways to all the women at home when Lonesome Rhodes is on his radio show, and they're sort of talking, we start talking about, I think it's like cleaning the grease trap or something, and there's a woman on her knees cleaning her oven, and she says, how does he know about that? So it's interesting how his populism clearly extends not just to working class men, and not just to working class white people, as might have been sort of customary at the time, but we see people of color represented, we see women represented, we see the domestic issues represented, and I think that's I think that's really telling. But Marcia is a really fascinating character, and I said in my introduction that I think that Neil's performance is so, in some ways, so raw and so, modern, because you see her conflict, and you see it simmer up and ultimately boil over. And a lot of performances or a lot of films might have had that person only sort of, once they turn into Gloria Swanson and start wearing the headdress and the dark clothes, might have only had them sort of simmer or boil in the last couple of scenes she's in. But you see her conflict sort of about Lonesome Road sort of start, and you see it grow and over the course of the whole film. And to maintain that continuity and that sort of continued growth, I think was really is really a testament to a lot of things with the film, but particularly Neil's performance. Dana, you have a comment or question?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. I want to talk about Patricia Neal and also the other women. One of the things that I found really fascinating about the Marcia character, particularly the last time I watched the movie, and I watched it a couple of times over the weekend. I've seen it a lot. I've seen the movie many times. Is that the story unfolds through that character, and a lot of the camera work, especially in the beginning part of the movie, puts our viewing onto her and the reactions that she has. Especially when she first meets Lonesome Rose, the character moves into her face, so that we can see her reaction to him. And many times, even when Lonesome Rose is speaking to her, the camera will go behind his head or behind her head, so that we're watching. What I'm trying to say is, the whole scenario unfolds through her. And interestingly, I read the short story, You're an Arkansas Traveler, and the story is written in the first person from Marcia's point of view. And what I thought was really interesting is I felt that the movie really captured that this is Marcia's story for maybe 2/3 of the movie. And then when it explodes and the audience is in Marcia's camp, we're able to watch what happens without Marcia as our eyepiece. So, I mean, I just think she's different from the other women in the movie. She's filmed differently from the other women in the movie. Her facial expressions are really different from the other women, certainly the women who are in the audiences. And the telling of the story is especially terrific, and because it unfolds through her eyes, at least to me, for the early parts of the movie.
No, I think that's a great point. It certainly does. And I think that, we, a lot of times, one of the interesting things I like to do with movies is I like to sort of ask myself after it's over and sort of say, well, whose story was that? I know who had the most screen time, or I know what character was played by the biggest name, but whose story was that really? And as you say, Dana, there's a good case, in part because of the way the film is shot, in part because of the way it's structured, that this is Marcia's story. I mean, she plucks him out of that jail, right? And that's part of the reason she's so overcome at the end. It's not just that he's this cancer that she's inflicted on the sort of, viewing public, but that she inflicted him. She brought him to attention. If she hadn't taken him out of there and given him a small platform and then facilitated him having a bigger one, and then sort of been, literally the woman behind the man, who was far more practical and sensible and in many ways savvy about business than he was, he wouldn't have gotten to any of the phases he got to. And so there's a very good case to be made that not only that she's responsible for what happens, that in a sense it is her story. I think that's a great point. Alan, you had a question?
Okay, a couple of questions actually. First, it didn't seem that anybody in the movie was offended that the Lee Remick character was a high school girl.
Yeah.
And I mean, okay, I understand in those days, people got married younger. I
But
know
usually they were both younger, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But did the movie attending population have any concerns about that? and along the lines of offensive behavior, when he was at that party at the end that nobody attended,
Well,
Yeah.
you gotta watch the movie first.
his verbal abuse on the wait staff. And did I hear as he was walking out that he called one of them a black monkey?
Hmm.
I mean, wow.
Yeah. So those are two good questions, and here's an interesting thing, and this is something that I think has changed in our culture over time, which it isn't just, sort of what types of behavior and speech might or may not be acceptable, but it's the difference between depicting that behavior at all on screen or associating that behavior on screen with who's really supposed to be a despicable character. And I think that's the difference, right? Is that I don't think that we are meant to think that society at large approved of his relationship with Lee Remick. I think that we are supposed to think that he was a deplorable character with tremendous appetites, and no one was going to stand up to him, and no one was going to let their disapproval, to the extent that it existed, be known. And I think that there are lots of ways that we see the corruption of his character, both excuse me, how he becomes more corrupt over time, but also sort of the nature of the encompassing corruption as his power grows. And that's one of the ways that manifests itself. And I think it's the same thing with the racial issue at the end. While, as we know from all having watched films at that time, the idea that the only African American, or mainly, there were other African Americans earlier in the film, but that all of the servants, or the waiters, butlers, whatever they are, would be African American, was unfortunately par for the course in Hollywood films of that time. But what he says to them was not. And that is, again, also meant to be seen as reflective of his desperation, his deplorable character, and so on. And I don't think would have been offensive merely for its presence. It was that it was said by this character who, by that point in the film, we are all supposed to think is truly despicable, and we pretty much do. So I agree with you that those two things stand out and are noteworthy, but I don't think they would have been quite as shocking for those reasons of context that I said. The other thing I'll mention, particularly when it comes to Lee Remick character, is that this is the late 1950s, and the movie industry had been operating under the production code for 23 years or so by this time. But a few things happened that caused them to want to loosen that up. And I should say the production code was their self-censorship regime that they agreed to in 1934, finally. And two of the things that really, well, three things actually, that led to them sort of loosening or revising that censorship, which I mentioned because the whole bit with Lee Remick, both the very strongly implied sex that she has as an underage person with at least two men in the film, and all of the sort of lecherous looks and everything during the baton twirling episode, none of that would have passed muster, at the beginning of the decade. But the industry felt it wasn't on a solid footing as it had been because of the antitrust laws, decrees of 1948 that forced them, by and large, to divest of their theaters. That hurt their economic model. Over the 50s, they're starting to have because that changed that gave theaters more latitude in what they showed. That meant that foreign films were starting to be shown, and foreign films, particularly from Europe, were known for having more sexuality and things like that. So that was a different type of competition for Hollywood. So they wanted to adjust to that. And then television, not that television had anything on it that was remotely so quote unquote scandalous, but the fact that you could now get visual stories shown to you for free in your house. So why should you leave the house? And one of the answers would be because the movies are going to give you things you can't get at home. And part of that was big budgets, and part of that was wide screens, and part of that was bright color. But part of it also was, unfortunately, um, uh, supposed teenage girls in their half shirts and batons. I don't condone the behavior. I'm just identifying what I think is pretty clearly the strategy, at least to an extent. And I won't say in having that in the movie, but in allowing that to be in the movie. Let me see. Are there other questions or comments? Oh, someone pointed out that this was the same year as Jerry Lee Lewis got into trouble for marrying his teenage cousin, which was, you know, that we know was a big scandal, in part because that was real, and in part because he was enormously popular for a number of years. Some other interesting questions that came via the chats. Oh, here's a very sort of simple one that I think is very interesting. The question is, or the statement, I guess, is Lonesome Roads needs Marcia. Does Marcia need Lonesome Roads? What do people think about that? Anybody want to jump in on that?
That was a midway through the movie when she brings him into her room. That was a pretty dramatic scene where he's walking out, and she has a quick decision to make, knowing full well that, you know, who he is and what his interest is in her. You can see it in it. I think you can see it in her face, where she's just kind of pulling the last card out of her deck to try and get him back. Because I saw this, you know, I saw this as Marcia's story. I saw it as being something that in the beginning she was very starry-eyed, and she made the point that the only thing that was important to her was increased ratings. She had been working for her uncle. She wanted to establish herself as competent and helpful in making sure that his struggling business raised money. That was her last ditch effort, and she kind of sold herself there.
It's okay.
But don't you think that also that he was holding out hope that maybe he would fall in love with her and then he would be faithful to her?
And then he would fall in love with her, and what?
And be faithful to her. Like when she finally brought him into her room, that he would change for her. That's what you were kind of, I know I was kind of hopeful for that maybe that would happen, but it did not, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we should acknowledge, and people are welcome to disagree with this if they like, but I think that there really are sort of two, you know, they each have two sort of tracks in which they think about the other, right? Lonesome thinks about her, certainly for her, you know, the professional doors she's opened and things like that, but he also thinks about her sort of as like a, you know, a consolation prize, you know, when he's lonely or there's no other woman around that he can call her and whatever. She thinks of him obviously as I think what Matt was just saying, as an opportunity for her to establish herself, you know, sort of as a prominent, you know, force and a real kind of, you know, business person in, you know, radio and then television. I think that's true, but I think we can't completely rule out her attraction to him. And the fact that we see who, you know, it's not an accident that we're told that basically her quote unquote option for a man prior to Lonesome Roads is that sheriff who puts Lonesome Roads in the drunk tank. And, you know, I mean, if that guy is drawn in all the Hollywood ways you draw someone to make them seem unappealing and like not a good option. And so there's something about, you know, there's something else that she wants, you know, maybe when he talks to her about being sort of one of those cold fishes or whatever however he sort of slights her as being uptight, you know, maybe there's something to that. Maybe we're meant to think she's heard that before, and that's a sort of a pressure point for her. So, you know, I think they both, you know, give things to each other, and they both want and take things from each other. I just think Marcia has a conscience that, you know, maybe its prominence in her mind ebbs and flows, but it's there. But I do think it's a sort of, you know, codependent may be too strong, but it's a mutually beneficial relationship, and that's part of what allows it to go on for so long, and I think part of what makes it so kind of potentially toxic.
Well, and Walter Matthau points that out with her when she's questioning why she ever fell for him. In his saying, everybody was falling for him. Clearly, I think the indictment in terms of how the movie industry was coming at the television industry was saying, this is a mass marketing, mass media way of kind of coalescing the will of lesser informed individuals nationwide. And that was, a straight shot at kind of flyover states and heartland America. But I think Walter Matthau makes that point, I think, pretty clear with her, and just saying, like, don't blame yourself, because he had a lot of people fooled.
Right. I mean, he did, of course, and that's true. But I think we're also meant to sort of think that Walter Matthau's a little bit sweet on Marcia himself, and I think he's trying to help her, and I understand why he wants to kind of give her some solace at that point. But I also think if that's the beginning and end of it, I think he's letting her off the hook a little bit easily, because unlike all those people on television, she saw far more of his warts than those people who only saw him on television did. But yeah, I mean, he's acknowledging that he's widely seductive, that the Lonesome Rhodes character was widely seductive, which of course is one of the major points of the film. Janice, you have a question or comment? Janice, I see your hand up. Okay. Then let's see. Oh, a question about Andy Griffith. Two-part question came over comments. One is he? Oh, Janice. Oh, okay. Is he? Who's the character based on? Well, the character was based in large part on Arthur Godfrey, and some of you probably are familiar with him. He was a very popular sort of variety show host who was sort of known to be, or thought to be, kind of a terror when he wasn't directly on camera. And I don't remember the specifics exactly, but word got out that he had on his show some sort of a sort of younger up and coming performer, and I guess he felt threatened by him, and he wasn't just content to kind of fire him. He kind of felt like he had to kind of publicly humiliate him. And I don't think it was exactly the same kind of hot mic situation as Lonesome Rhodes, but word of that got out. And that sort of made people realize that Godfrey wasn't all or only what he showed on TV. I think there's no doubt about him being an influence. I also have to say that I'm convinced, and I've read some research to support the notion, that Joe McCarthy was a source of influence. Someone who rose to tremendous power, was one of the era's great demagogues, right up until someone sort of had the nerve and the wherewithal to, kind of pop his balloon, which is what obviously Marcia does to Lonesome Rhodes. And I also think it's important to note that not just what, I'm drawing a blank on the lawyer's name, Welch, I think. Is his name Welch?
Yes.
Yes, Welch, who sort of said to McCarthy, finally, at long last, sir, have you no decency? Which the Army McCarthy hearings, which helped make McCarthy a star, were his undoing, because people saw that and saw the footage of it. There's also the See It Now that Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly did, where they actually didn't offer any commentary on McCarthy at all. They just used his own footage. And so the parallel between the medium that gave the person rise or power being used to ultimately undermine and do them in, I think that's an important parallel for McCarthy as well. Janice, did you have your question?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Particularly thinking about the Patricia Neal character and when she decided to have sex with him. I think that was very indicative of something that was common at the time, in terms of a very romantic notion about what you can accomplish with a relationship, what a woman could do in saving a man, or her love would make such a difference and that he would come around. And I really saw that in her when that scene occurred.
No, I mean, I agree. I think that she's sort of up to that point, she's always a little bit disappointed, and to varying degrees disappointed when he exhibits bad behavior or says something, kind of insulting of the people that kind of put him where he is. But after that, when she sees those slights, both to her and to others, she takes it even harder than she had. And I think, I think it's for the reason you said, that she really thought that was going to be a turning point, and she believed what he was saying. Which was the problem for everybody, was believing what he was saying. Let's see. Some other questions.
Hey, Andrew, there's some questions in the Q&A as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Let me get to those. Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot, Heather. Oh, this other question, the second part of Kathleen's question. Andy Griffith was director's first choice for the role. As far as I know, yes. When I said, I realized from some comments that I may have misled some of you. I didn't mean to suggest that Marlon Brando was somehow the first choice in my introductory remarks. All I meant was, as we think of Marlon Brando as the premier actor of his generation, and we'd seen what he could do when directed by Kazan in both Waterfront and Streetcar. And I think that Griffith gives as exceptional of a performance here as Brando does. It's certainly in Streetcar and maybe as in Waterfront. Walter Matthau was just getting started, was another question. He'd been in some supporting roles, and excuse me, but he hadn't. This was one of the most prominent roles he'd had to that point. It was really pretty early in his career, and I wish he had a chance to be even more sarcastic and funny, as we would see him be later in his career. Another question, Matt had another question. Do you see this as analogous to Pandora's box? Something presents as an item of value, but really is a source of trouble. I've never thought of that direct analogy, but of course, what you say is the way all new technologies are perceived, right? There's always a camp that says, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. It's going to lead to this utopia that's going to allow X, Y, and Z. But then, think about the internet, right? People, when the internet was starting to emerge and become a dominant influence, people were probably saying, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This will let 50 people from around a county get together to discuss movies. And isn't that wonderful? But then other people were saying, yes, but it will also make lots of people's lives only porn and video games. And isn't that terrible? And that happens with every major medium. And that was certainly happening with television over the course of the 1950s. And I think that's part of the criticism. And that's one of the reasons why that's one of the reasons why I always take this film with a little bit of a grain of salt, of course, because you have filmmakers, implicitly at least, criticizing television. I guess explicitly also criticizing television. And that is, it's a valid point to take. And there are many reasons that television was and is worthy of criticism, but it's also the competition for these filmmakers. And so I think that's a consideration as well. But yeah, it's obviously meant to show the power and the strength and the potential, but also the downside. We have another question. So the question sort of is about the kind of negative view of populism in the face of the crowd, and how On the Waterfront was seen as an anti-union kind of message. And then add to that sort of Kazan's known, and Schulberg for that matter, his known anti-communism. How does that all factor in? And, I guess I would say that in a way that kind of depends, I don't think on one's political perspective as much as you think about where populism falls on the political spectrum, right? Because I think we're living in an era where there's, sort of extensive populism on the right side of the political spectrum. And, you know, so does that mean that Kazan was criticizing things on the right side of the political spectrum in this movie, where he's criticizing things in the left, thought to be on the left side of the political spectrum in On the Waterfront? I'm not really sure. I think one has to have a better sense of sort of political history and theory than I do to really be able to draw that line. Let's see what else. I think this is a really interesting. Someone asked, and I think this is a fair question for each of us to think about, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts, particularly those of you who said you've seen this film before, maybe on many occasions, which is, how has it changed over time? And how has the person asked how my experience or perception of the film has changed over the time, seeing as how I first saw it, you know, over 25 years ago. And I think in some sense, in one sense, it hasn't changed that much, because the events it depicted for me have always been history and have always been something I've had to learn about and didn't experience firsthand. On the other side, I'm much more politically aware and politically engaged and more mature just in general than I was when I first saw it 25 years ago. And, you know, but that being said, I think that overall where I fall hasn't changed that much, and that I think it's a bit, to the extent that this film can be seen as a criticism of the medium itself, I'm very reluctant to sort of cast blame for societal phenomena on a technology or a medium. Maybe that's because I have made my career studying and helping people get more out of a particular visual medium, but I think that's been consistent. I think it's really up to individuals to think a bit more about what they're seeing and what they're thinking and what they're believing than that film might lead us to believe. Janet Evans, did you have a question?
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about the elitism versus the popularism in the movie? And can you hear me? Actually, I literally had to change devices.
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Oh, good. So that came through a lot, of course, with the Lonesome Road character. But what else was going on there, do people think?
No, I mean, I think that's a great point. And if you sort of tried to chart, you know, kind of make a chart or a graph or I don't know, some other nerdy concoction of where the characters fall on sort of the high culture, low culture, or elite versus, you know, high class versus low class, whatever you want to say, I think it's a bit tricky, right? Because, I mean, you have the Walter Matthau character, who is, you know, Vanderbilt 44, right? He's supposed to be this kind of intellectual, East Coast, highly educated person. And on the one hand, he sees through Rhodes, you know, from pretty early on, not from the beginning. He seems to drink the Kool-Aid a bit when he first signs on, but he sees into him, through him pretty early on. But on the other hand, is that a character that we're supposed to like as viewers, that we're supposed to identify with, that we're supposed to root for? I wonder about that. And I think that that's sort of a complicated depiction of it. And I think the same thing is, we can say the same thing about class and status for Lonesome Rhodes, for that matter, because his class changes, right? And he starts out and he's as much of a working class fella as he can be, and at the end he's a ridiculously penthouse dwelling, you know, upper class person. And is there any sort of change there? You know, it's sort of in a way, it's kind of a chicken and egg question. Was he always terrible and then he just became terrible with wealth and power? Or was it the terrible aspects of his personality that enabled him to become wealthy and powerful? I think it's hard to say, but I think your point about, you know, elitism is a really, really important one, because of course that's the other side of the populist coin. You know, a lot of people talk about in contemporary politics, you know, and I don't want to get into a specific political debate, but just sort of from an electoral point of view, that you know, Donald Trump wouldn't have been the nominee for the Republicans if nominees were picked the way they were picked a couple decades ago, which was, you know, the convention in a smoke-filled room, not simply counting the votes of primaries across the states. Some people forget that primaries in the course of picking party nominees are relatively new, or at least relatively new in terms of being kind of universally adopted. And then on the other hand, that was the issue, at least with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, which was, you know, if that process for that party at that time had been a completely sort of transparent one primary voter, one vote, no super delicate stuff, would that have had a different turnout? And how did that affect people? So the relationship between elite and populist and good and bad and left and right and is, I mean, it's a mess. And so
Well, because yeah,
go ahead.
because the politicians wanted to use him. I mean, they understood full well his powers to influence, and they really wanted to use them, and they were the elites. And so on the one hand, he had this disdain for them, but on another hand, they're all playing each other.
Right, but he also he had a disdain for them, but he also wanted what they could give him. He talks about being what, Secretary of National Morale or something like that. I mean, you know, you can't disdain elites too much if you're hoping to make your own cabinet position. So I think that shows the complicated relationship. Now, we could say, well, they were going to use him, so he was going to use them right back and turnabout is fair play, and I think that's true, but I think it also tells you something about the hypocrisy and the hostility and the loathing that existed in the Rhodes character, that was the course he charted. Daphne, do you have a question?
Yeah, we're unmuted now.
Okay.
I was feeling a little disappointed at the end with Walter Matthau turning into the storyteller and telling everyone what would become of Lonesome, where I felt like the rest of the film was a little more subtle. I felt like suddenly they jumped in with a different kind of thing where he was suddenly the storyteller.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And that's a knock on, that's a valid criticism, I think, of a lot of movies. And if you think about a lot of movies, even some really, really great ones that have been ruined by the last 5 or 10 minutes because someone, whether it's, and I don't know who it was in this case, whether it was Schulberg, whether it was Kazan, whether it was the producer, gets nervous that the audience isn't going to get that they're not supposed to think highly of Rhodes, and they tack that on. I mean, does anybody remember the last 5 minutes of Psycho, which is pretty much all that psychologist or psychiatrist in the police station explaining every mental tick that Norman Bates had and how it just completely deflates the movie? It's a problem, and I agree with you that it is a weak point of an otherwise I think strong film that seems to respect the intelligence of the viewer, and that's the real problem with it, right?
But can
Yeah.
I say that in some ways, to me, that's the most prescient thing that happens in the film, because the fact of the matter is, in our day, we can see that very thing happening. Men particularly, are committing these terrible atrocities to women, and they disappear, and then they come back. They're starting to come back. So while it may have been a poor choice for an ending of that movie, I think it's prescient. It's true. People come back after they've committed terrible things because the audience forgets. Ooh.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that maybe Daphne and I, to an extent, are a little guilty of looking at the film from 2000 or 2020 or whatever, when we literally have decades of what you're talking about, Dana, of that happening again and again, and maybe it wouldn't have been quite so clear to people in 1957. And I mean, keep in mind, in 1957 they hadn't even seen Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon by himself is a great example of how people can take some time away and come back. Just that one politician's career, right? And so, it's possible that what seems to be a fair bit of spoon feeding to us in the here and now, maybe in 1957 wouldn't have come across that way. I think that's a fair reminder, Dana. Let's see, other questions. Sorry, I'm just checking here. Well, actually, let me look. Oh, there was a question, and actually this goes back to sort of a couple of recent comments. There's a question I got online asking if Schulberg and Kazan were thinking of Hitler's rise when they were charting the rise of, an unsavory fellow with problematic politics who has a tremendous capacity for using visual media. And I have to say no. They were not thinking about Hitler, and I don't think that they would have wanted that point of comparison to be applied to even sort of their worst kind of domestic political enemies at the time. What I will say, though, is that one of the things that gave them a sense of urgency about making this movie was their Schulberg's visits to Madison Avenue and learning about advertising and how that medium was being used to influence attitudes and perspectives across the board, but particularly in politics. They're one of the, I guess, most successful elements of Eisenhower's presidential campaign were his TV spots. And there was a case that he was sort of the first politician to sort of widely and successfully use television advertising. And he was given tremendous amounts of coaching by actors, Robert Montgomery, and ad executives and others, which you see brought to the film in the session where Rhodes is giving the presidential candidate coaching. I'd like to think that they had a little bit higher opinion of Eisenhower than they did of that guy, but it's not exactly a fair comparison. But that, if you want to talk about actual historical figures that influenced this character in this film, that was certainly one of them. Let's see. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes. Who is that?
It's Janet. Hi.
Janet, hi.
Yeah. How about his sidekick from jail? Why do you think he brought him in, and how is it that he became like his faithful servant in a way, and they genuinely seem to like each other?
Yeah, I mean, Beanie, right? Good
Beanie,
old
right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because when Marcia first goes to pick them up on the side of the road, he sort of lets Beanie go. But then he brings Beanie along, and Beanie stays with him, although Beanie's not there at the end, is he? I think it's interesting. I think it shows a bit of insecurity on Rhodes's part, and I think it shows that maybe he's not entirely the authentic man of the people he claims to be. When they're in that sort of political bull session with the presidential candidate who has the comb over, he points to Beanie and sort of says, "I trust this guy's instincts like nobody else's. What he thinks that an instinct from his gut is worth gold," or whatever the word is he uses. Excuse me. And so I think that's part of it. I think we know Rhodes isn't authentic, right? Excuse me. We know Rhodes isn't authentic because we see Marcia ask him, is that town you mentioned real? Is that uncle you mentioned real? And we sort of know from Rhodes's answers that they're not. And I think Beanie is a further indication of that all that sort of homespun, authentic wisdom he has maybe isn't really all completely homespun or all authentic. And I think that has something to do with it. The other thing I think is that, you know, I think you look at Beanie and Rhodes and you can sort of see as the film goes on, you can sort of see a before and after. Because, you know, maybe Beanie's shoes get a little nicer or his clothes get a little nicer, but he's still just, you know, he's still basically Beanie and still isn't really trying to cater to anybody. But whereas Rhodes gets, you know, sort of more highfalutin as the film goes on. So I think there's a couple of reasons for the character to be there. Let's see. Boy, Matt has a zinger of a question here. Matt, if you're still on, is there any way you could kind of boil this down? I don't want to read all this out loud to everybody.
Sorry.
That's
I think
okay.
I was kind of jumping off of Janet's point earlier, and connecting back to a Pandora's box. I not to harp on that issue. I see the whole thing as really just that story from the kind of literal box that Martha takes him out of in the beginning of the movie to the fact that it keeps growing and growing and growing, and the numbers keep growing and they keep connecting to his influence, and he calls himself an influencer, and he just kind of he grows in his ratings, he grows in the millions of people that he refers to as far as who he bears influence over, you know, and then that all gets put back in his box when he's having really a meltdown at the end, and Walter Matthau is giving his soliloquy about how don't worry about this, you know, people will forget him and they're going to forget you and it's going to be somebody else soon, but it's not you anymore. Kind of an allusion to the fact that somebody else, through somehow recklessly, will open that box again somehow, some way. You know, and I didn't think that the reference to him wanting to be in the cabinet was what was necessarily something that connected to his being in any way elite. More just his kind of grandiose and, as you said earlier, his appetite for more and more. And you know, minister of good feelings or whatever they're going to give him,
morale,
minister of morale. That's, you know, that would be like a giveaway, and that would be again one of those things saying that, like, you know, people could make mistakes if they don't recognize the power that this guy's voice has brought to them, and if they don't respect, I think, the danger that he kind of portrays. And by keeping him in there, you know, that would have been, if things had not gone south so quickly, that would have been, you know, kind of an ominous future, you know, seeing that the political elite were making the same mistake and kind of kicking the can down the road for him. So I don't know if it was more of a question or just kind of a reference. I did wonder if anybody else was picking up any kind of themes with dogs, because in the beginning he talks about the dog catcher, and he you know, if the mayor, if Stuck in a Small Town was a person, the sheriff represents that person. But he talked about the dog catcher. There's dogs there. Talked about how cats aren't trustworthy and maybe you need some dogs. And does the Beatty character represent the dog that he let go on the road earlier when he was a kid, you know, kind of like a Rosebud issue, that is brought back to him when the TV network reconnected the two of them?
Wow.
Yeah, I got to say wow to that too. Excuse me, I hadn't thought of that and I hadn't heard of that, but I do think the dog thing is on purpose. I mean, he mentions Checkers was Nixon's dog that supposedly kind of led the way for him to, Nixon that is, to kind of, you know, save his political, or at least minimize the damage to his political career at that point. And we always, I'm sorry, we always, if we think about past presidents and their pets, what a big deal is made over, you know, the president's dog, and, you know, oh my gosh, this president has a cat, and all that stuff. So I do think that that is relevant. Excuse me. I also think, Matt, you made a comment that sort of points to social media. And I think that you can only imagine what Kazan and Schulberg would have thought of this if and how the story would have been. I don't think all that much different, just kind of accelerated the way social media seems to accelerate everything. But I think it's basically the same sort of story, the same sort of scenario that they're talking about. It's just, magnified and intensified because at least nowadays people tend to look at social media a lot more often over the course of a day than they do at the television. And of course now they have it with them everywhere they go as well.
Well, and at the time, they would have had they would have seen, right? Historically, they would have said, okay, so you've got everything in religion prior to the Gutenberg press, then everything in religion after, and then everything in religion after the mass distribution of print media through newspapers, and then the invention of the radio, and then the invention of, or I guess the wireless, then the invention of the television. They were admiring a problem. And I think we have the benefit right now in 2020 of looking at social media and the fact that influencer has become a career for some, and that the negative implication of social media impact on the political process is dangerous, just in general. So yeah, it would be great to be able to have them here to kind of admire the problem with us from 60 years later.
Yeah, we got another question over the Q&A function, asking if in any way this can be seen as a kind of acknowledgement of mistake or an expression of remorse for kind of naming names during HUAC, which by the time this film came out would have been 10 years earlier. And again, I think the relationship between populism and sort of where it falls in the political spectrum is so complicated that I imagine that reading could be made of this film. But the one thing I think that complicates that perspective is that I don't think to the day he died, I don't think Kazan ever regretted doing that, or at least never stated publicly that he regretted doing that. So I don't know that he would have felt that way in 1957 and then gone back around to feeling differently. So I'm inclined to think that that's not what they were doing at that point in time. But
can I say something that I just don't want the conversation to end without talking a little bit about some of the things in this film that were just hysterical, because it was very entertaining. And there are two really to me. The Vitadex sequence was a riot, and it just said so much about what commercials were like in the 50s and what commercials are still like. I cracked up, particularly when that huge bottle of what we would today call Viagra appeared on a girlfriend's, night table. I mean, it was hysterical. And it took a few times watching that movie for me to not feel like, well, what is this? Why am I watching this? After I got to know the film better and I could relax, I really enjoyed that sequence because I thought it was hysterical. The other thing that I think has to be mentioned is the wonderful Kay Medford moment when the first Mrs. Rhodes comes back. That whole vignette is in the short story, but nobody could have captured that with just the wonderful way that Kay Medford did when she sat down and just treated herself to a little breakfast, which she was spewing all over the coffee pot when she told, the Mrs. Rhodes to be that she wanted the 3 Gs a month. I mean, those moments made the movie a little palatable in places where it got kind of heavy-handed, and I just sort of wanted to mention that.
No, I mean, I think that's great. I think there are other little moments where sort of the movie ceases to be, or temporarily stops being, a criticism of television and starts basically being television. And the Vitadex ad is one of them. Some of his earlier antics when he's sort of taking a shot at the station owner or the mattress king or what have you. There's definitely some levity thrown in there. And it's interesting too, because as you say, it's very much of that time and a very good representation of that time. And it's made, by someone who probably has a fair amount of derision, maybe too strong, but let's just say at least not a ton of respect for that medium at that particular moment. Are there any last? Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to say, to get back to the point about his being an influencer and the way that he was able to, in a sense, make things go viral by tipping the tables, turning the tables at people that he was picking a bone with, and B, people in power, and using that. And so that's the other part that made it, to me, so prescient with the mob kind of online mentality of today, of just this almost uncontrollable reactions from people. And he had this ability to make that happen.
Yeah, he does, and he unleashes a fanaticism again that we see in certain political subcultures today. And I think the other thing that's important is, you know, at least early on, he's giving a voice to people. First, he's genuinely giving a voice to people and a representation to people on radio and television who don't normally get it, whether it's the housewife cleaning the oven or it's the African American family that has gone on particularly hard times. I mean, there are people who say that, you know, I think they have an African American family watching, saying that they've never seen Black people on TV before. And
Right.
that is at once a criticism of television for sort of how kind of, you know, homogenous it was, still is to an extent, but particularly at that time. But it's also a point of about how much power there can be in giving a voice to people who didn't have it, who haven't had it traditionally or hadn't had it to that point. And that's something we've seen in a number of recent political movements, and both for, you know, constructive and arguably destructive consequences. So that's another important and prescient element of the movie. Absolutely. Well, it's been an hour. I think we've given this film a good going over. I appreciate everybody signing up and joining on. And if you have any other comments, please do submit them. You can use the Ask Andrew function on the Film Studies Online page on our website. You can do the survey. Hope you will do the survey for this particular Zoom session. And I'll also mention that we're going to try to do this. Once a week at this time. We already have our film picked for next week. I won't tell you what it is, but just like for this film, on Thursday, you'll get notice of a video introduction, and then there'll be a session early the following week. We've got a few weeks set up already, so hopefully you'll join us moving forward. Thanks very much, everybody. And
Thank you.
glad you enjoyed the film.
Yeah,
And,
it's excellent. Thanks.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And hope-
Thanks. This is great.
Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Good luck.
Andrew.
Hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 We had enough.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Can they hear you?
Yes, they can hear us.
Bye.
We totally hear you.
Yay.
She liked my clapping.
Excellent social distancing. Good night.
Good night.
All right, Larry, turn us off.